Hi there, I'm Aaron Collier, and I'm the Technical Education Manager at PlatformSH. I'm here today to talk to you about reduce, reuse, reward, the 3 R's for how to not repeat yourself in your documentation. To start with, just a brief introduction to who I am. My name is Aaron. I come originally from a small town outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I traveled around to a couple of different places for my education in the United States to go to college and university. And then I came over to Europe, and I'm currently based out of Brno in the Czech Republic. But I work for a French company, PlatformSH, which is based out of Paris, France. So it's a distributed company, so I have some experience with working from different kinds of places. But it does mean that documentation is important for us as a company because we don't meet in person very often. We need to have things written down. As the Technical Education Manager, I am in charge of the PlatformSH docs, which are handily located at docs.platform.sh. PlatformSH is a platform as a service, which means it allows you to host your websites and other web applications in the cloud, and you can manage them using YAML files and so on. Our docs are completely open source, so you can find them on GitHub. And you can see all of the details of how we have done everything. I would say not everything that we have done there follows the best principles of what I'm going to talk about in this talk today, but we're working on it, always trying to get better. Our documentation is built on Hugo, so that means we have a static site that works fast, even though it has a lot of content. It has a lot of different kinds of things in different formats. It has data and other kinds of content, but it's all built in Markdown and YAML files and things like that. And it's all put together by Hugo, so you can see some examples of what I will talk about today. What am I going to talk about? I'm going to be talking about content reuse, why you might want to reuse content, some examples of how to reuse content, not necessarily the best thing in every situation, but some examples of how you could do it using Hugo, and also what you might want to be careful of while you are thinking about reuse, what some common problems might be. To start with, I would note that we have some different names for the same kinds of things. We do have lots of content in our documentation, and we do reuse it in different kinds of places. That's the basic thing. It's the content reuse, but you can also call it creating a single source of truth, meaning there's one place where you know it is always correct. Because you could, in theory, go to different pages in documentation or other kinds of websites and see that there's different content there about the same kind of thing. So maybe the instructions are slightly different in different kinds of places, and then you don't know which one is correct. So what you want to do is put it in one place, which is the single source of truth, where you will know that it is always correct. And another name for the same kind of thing is transclusion, which is about the inclusion of files inside of other files. So in our case, most of the time it means using Markdown files inside of other Markdown files. Or sometimes we have HTML files used basically inside the Markdown files to eventually build the HTML that is the final file. So what are the benefits of reusing content? Well, the first is to avoid repetition. There's a long-standing principle within development about that's called the dry principle, which means don't repeat yourself. Because as we've seen, if you have different kinds of things in different places, you don't know which one is correct. You don't want to do the same kind of thing over and over again. You want to have one thing that works correctly and use that and only that. Also, you might want to have some pieces of information where you only update it once and then it will be correct everywhere. I mean, like I was saying, sometimes instructions might vary in different parts of your site and you don't want that to happen, or maybe the name of something varies. It also helps with automation. As I noted, we have some files that are data files, such as YAML files, and we can have a script that updates those YAML files in one place, and then that YAML file is used to build content in various places using the same source of truth. Also, other people do this. We don't necessarily ourselves, but I know that some people use the same content and create different outputs, such as they might want to create PDFs or other ways to display kinds of things, maybe even JSON files you can do with Hugo as well. And you might want to use different variable names, different things that appear differently in different kinds of outputs. So you can do all of that if you're not repeating yourself in different kinds of ways that are hard to track down and change. So as some examples, you might want to update a product name or a project name, something that you have that is used in various places. If you want to have that name only once as a single source of truth, then you would know it is always in that one place. That is the one place where it is correct. And then maybe a different project has some contention about what your name of your project is, and you can update that once and it will be the same other places. Or for installation instructions, for example, we have ways to install something in a separate guide for installation, and we also have a more comprehensive tutorial that walks beginners through each of the steps, and we want to repeat the basic instructions for how to install there. Not all of the context, but the basic instructions are repeated in 2 different kinds of places. And we want those instructions, if they ever have to change, if the commands are different, we want those instructions to always be correct. And so we don't repeat it, but we base it off of one file that is then used in 2 different places on the site. Also, if you have a project like ours where you integrate with various different kinds of services and different kinds of things, the introduction to those integrations might be the same. Like, the reason you use one particular service is probably the same kind of reason you would use a different competing service. So for example, if you're competing between like Google search and Microsoft Bing, and you want to integrate some search engine optimization, the reason for those 2 kinds of things is probably the same. Why you want to work on search engine optimization is the same. The details of how to integrate might be different, but the reasons would be the same. And so that introductory content might be shared between your 2 pieces of content, so that whenever somebody comes to the page about Google search or about Microsoft, they don't have to go elsewhere. All of the information that they have is contained within one page. So here's a basic example of some repetition that might exist. It's something similar that might exist on our site, for example. You talk in the first paragraph, we talk about the reasons for doing an integration. So to get the most out of this other product, which in the first example is Task Manager, and at the bottom it's Calendar. So we're saying that those are 2 different things we're integrating with. To get the most out of that, you want to integrate it with Project X. And then you have the reasons for that. And then you have the basic instruction steps for how to do it. And assuming that your CLI works this way, then that would mean that you can run the same kind of instructions for each of them. So you see, most of this content is basically the same between the 2 different kinds of integrations. So in order to reduce some of that repetition, you could resolve the project name. You could create a shortcode that's called product name. So in this example, we're creating a Markdown file that we can use to repeat that we can use to resolve the project name in various different kinds of places. So there's one shortcode that's in your layouts, shortcodes directory, and it's given this name. You could also use an HTML file if you wanted to give it different kinds of styling or something like that. Or perhaps you have an abbreviation in there and you want to use some HTML abbreviation tags. You can do all of that inside of a shortcode. And then you want to use that shortcode. So in this case, we used Markdown. So what we do is we put it inside the brackets, and then we use the % sign, which shows that we are using this shortcode as Markdown. If we were using HTML, we would use angle brackets instead of the % sign. But this means that in both of these cases, we have the product name shortcode. And if our product name shortcode updates in any way, if it changes in any way, then the built pages for each of these 2 things will change with the updated name of the project, or perhaps the updated styling, or the updated class that you're adding to it, or whatever you're adding to it. It will be the same in all of the different kinds of places. If you have integrations that are the same between different kinds of places, you can also reuse instructions. So for this example, you would create a different shortcode. Instead of just the product name, you would create the setup instructions file, and you would call this with the 2 things on the top of the screen here, which would be the setup instructions shortcode, where you pass it the information of what the integration is. Like in the first case, it would be the task manager integration. And in the second case, it would be the calendar integration. And in both of these cases, the instructions are going to be the same. As you can see in the part down below, the instructions are repeated there. So what you can do is in that shortcode file, you can get a variable, which in case you're reusing the name of the integration in the file, you can get the variable and use that variable inside the file by calling it as in the example. So that means that most of the content is the same, but that part that is called integration will change based on what you pass, what information you pass to it when you are invoking the shortcode. So that means you can reuse the instructions, but the name of the integration will change, and you can use that as many times as you would like inside of it. It's also possible that your instructions would change. For example, if you have a different CLI command for one integration as for another integration, then you can change the instructions within that shortcode. So in this example, the first half of the shortcode is the same, but in the instructions, we have a new line in the first step where it says that if the integration is the task manager, you use one specific command, and if it's not the task manager, then you use a different command. So in this way, you can use the properties that you are passing to it to change what kinds of instructions happen. So that means most of the instructions are the same, but one of the details can change so that you don't have to change the other things multiple times, but that command will be different for different integrations. So this shows that you can reuse the content in different ways depending on the context in which you are using, which means you're not just using the same content again, but it can vary based on the context that you are passing it. Now, if you are very familiar with Hugo, you might notice that there is a problem with the syntax that I was using in the previous examples, that you can't use shortcodes inside of other shortcodes. So if I just go back 1 second, in this example at the top, in the third line, it said to integrate it with product name. But that will not parse correctly because you can't use the shortcode inside of the other shortcode. You can change the nested shortcode into a partial. So you would move it from your shortcodes directory to your partials directory. And then the top level one, instead of using it as a shortcode, would use it as a partial, which you can see in the fourth line here, where it says partial product name, and you pass it the information that you would like to pass it. I mean, you could pass it information in this example. In general, you probably wouldn't have to if it's the product name, but you can also pass information to partials so that that can make use of it in terms of creating different variables, using different things in different kinds of context. You can also pass it the entire context by just using a period and so on. So this does add some complexity to it. Whenever you're nesting information inside of different kinds of information, it makes it harder to update. It especially makes it harder for people who aren't familiar with your system to figure out where exactly they need to update something in order to get a change in the final thing. But if you have something simple like a product name, then this might make sense for you. It really depends on your context and your content and what you are doing with your documentation and other content. It's also true that if you have a lot of content that is reused, it can be difficult to organize, especially if you're putting it all inside of your shortcodes, then that can get slightly overwhelming. And if you have other shortcodes that you're using for layouts, for other kinds of things, it can be hard to find the appropriate it can be hard to find the appropriate shortcode to update within your directory structure. I mean, one thing you can do is make sure from the beginning, you're thinking about what you're doing. You're creating directories that will be clear. This is for repeated content for guides, or this is for repeated instructions, or this is for project names, or so on. If you create an intentional directory structure, it does make it easier. Or you can also create a shortcode that will transclude, which will include other Markdown files from a special directory that's made just for them. And then you could have separate files inside of that. That allows you to separate your shortcodes that you're using for layouts and other things, completely separate from shortcodes that you're using for content. So as an example, you could create an include content. So if you have a directory for your files that you want to include, and let's say you call that directory snippets, you could create a shortcode that would look something like this, where you get the first property that's passed to it, and you create a string from that inside the snippets directory. You pass it to the read file, so it creates the read file, and you create safe HTML out of that. The safety HTML you would use instead of Markdownify, because the safe HTML ensures that headings and other things that are included inside of that file are included inside the table of contents of your final file. And then you could invoke it. Say you have an example .md markdown file in your snippets directory, then in any other file throughout your content, you could use the include shortcode, which you would pass just the name of the file that you would like to include inside your other piece of content. So this is a way that you could create simple instructions and things like that and include them in other things. This will include any kind of markdown formatting or anything like that. There are some potential drawbacks to this particular solution, the first one is it doesn't process Hugo commands. So that means you can't really use variables or partials inside of this particular syntax. If you're using this shortcode and then reading the file, it's not going to then process any kinds of Hugo commands inside of that. Also, if you put that kind of content outside your content directory in a separate directory called snippets, then updates to the files that are inside the snippets aren't seen as content updates. So if you're running like Hugo serve, then updates to there won't refresh the site automatically, so it won't necessarily process that as something that is updated automatically. I mean, it will do it whenever you're building it, so that's not a problem for the builds, but if you're doing some sort of development, then that can be slightly more complicated. It is suitable for basic Markdown that's repeated, but not necessarily kind of complex scenarios. If you're using variables or you're changing things based on the context or anything like that, it doesn't work very well. But if you're just using small snippets of content that are repeated, like an introductory paragraph or some simple instructions or things like that, then it can be a good way to separate those out to make it clearly organized so that you can find that information in the future. So those are different kinds of ways you can do it. You can also, there are other kinds of ways that you can do it as well, such as putting it inside your content directory and then using .content to find it, although then you have to make sure it's excluded from the rest of your site and so on. But it just really depends on the exact kinds of ways that what you're trying to accomplish. Because you don't want to make it so complicated that it's hard to use, because part of the point of doing this is to simplify your content and make it easier to use. Some things that you might want to watch out for while you are reusing content, and some of these ideas are gone into in more depth by Anna Gasparian, who did a talk called "Don't Shoot Yourself in the Foot with Content Reuse," which is an interesting talk, which I would recommend looking out, which I would recommend watching if you are interested in more details about these kinds of things. But some of the basic things that you want to watch out for while you're thinking about reusing content is sometimes content is reused when it's unnecessary. As I mentioned, when you're creating these kinds of shortcodes or other kinds of things, it moves the content out of the file and puts it in another place. So sometimes you will have like a shortcode that's like that, that's only used on one page. And then it's not really being reused, and then it's in a separate file. So it's harder to read through a single file, make updates to the content, and so on, because it's not really necessary to be reusing that content. Or sometimes the people put logic inside the reused content that is so complex that it might as well just be different on each page. Another problem is, especially when you're using nested content or different kinds of complicated things, it can be hard to find where to update. If you're using a partial inside a shortcode and somebody comes to the original page they have to go through a few different layers in order to find out what they need to update in order to make a change on your final documentation site, which can be complex and difficult, and it makes it harder to review and make changes, which the point of this is to make it simpler to make changes and have things be correct. It's also true that if you have complex nesting or complexity in general, it can be somewhat fragile. It means it can break if something changes. So once you get into that kind of thing, you want to make sure that you're keeping it as simple as possible so that it will be resistant to any kind of changes that might break the content or make it more difficult. Also, one thing to keep in mind is search engines like Google do decrease the relevance of search results if content is repeated. So if you're repeating lots of content across your site in different kinds of places, it means that search results might be less useful for the people who are searching for them, because that repeated content can create confusion for users, and also might mean for search engine optimization that ranking engines like Google's will make your pages less relevant for the people. So just to keep in mind, just because you can reuse content doesn't mean you should. The dry principle is an important principle. You don't want to repeat yourself unnecessary, but you also want to think about the KISS principle, which means keep it simple, stupid, which is perhaps a little insulting, but you can think about it as you want to make sure that things are as simple as they need to be, so that when you are reusing content, it doesn't do things unnecessarily. It doesn't create additional complexities that make it harder to use the content in any kind of way. So these are things you want to think about while you are reusing your content, but it still is important to reuse content when possible. You just need to have the balance of when it makes sense versus when it adds an additional layer of complexity that is unnecessary. So that's it for my talk. So I want to thank you for listening and paying attention. My name again is Aaron Collier. You can find this talk at collier.cz, and you can reach out to me at any time at aaron@collier.cz. If you have any questions or thoughts about reusing content, I'd be happy to discuss them. So thank you for listening, and good luck in reusing content responsibly.